Newly released documents that were missing from the Epstein files contain serious, unverified allegations against President Trump. The Justice Department posted 3 FBI memos describing interviews with a woman who accuses both Jeffrey Epstein and President Trump of sexually assaulting her when she was a teenager. The White House calls the accusations completely baseless. CNN's Paula Reed is in Washington with the latest. And Paula, these were missing from earlier file releases, right?
That's right. And this individual was interviewed by the FBI 4 times. And initially, only 1 memo was released in that initial batch of documents released by the Justice Department. And that was an interview where she made allegations against Jeffrey Epstein, but not against President Trump. Now, yesterday, these additional summaries were released, and they detail the types of allegations that she made against President Trump.
All right, guys, Adam is here. So what just happened? The Supreme Court ruled 9-0, including Trump's own 3 appointees, that he has no immunity from criminal probes in the Epstein obstruction case. It's the most complete judicial rejection possible, with 0 room to spin it as partisan. That immunity shield is gone permanently in this case.
The Supreme Court delivered a heavy blow to special counsel Jack Smith's election interference case against former President Donald Trump, ruling along partisan lines that Trump has broad immunity for acts taken while he was in office.
This will be referred to from now on as a landmark opinion of the Supreme Court. It's not only important for President Trump's criminal case, they really have set a framework for all future presidents. Donald Trump's defense team puts forward this argument that a former president should be held completely immune from prosecution for any of the acts that they performed while in office.
I feel that as a president, you have to have immunity. Very simple.
The Supreme Court says, quote, "The president enjoys no immunity for his unofficial acts, and not everything the president does is official," end quote.
The practical consequence of that ruling is as significant as the ruling itself. Federal prosecutors can now pursue obstruction charges over the Justice Department's deliberate and documented withholding of Epstein files, the files that reportedly contain thousands of references to Trump. The files that reportedly include documented records of calls spanning years.
The House Oversight Committee have launched an investigation following reports the Justice Department withheld some Epstein files related to allegations President Trump sexually abused a minor. The New York Times is reporting the FBI memos removed from public view were summaries of interviews about claims made by a woman that she had been sexually and physically assaulted by President Trump decades earlier when she was 13. The woman came forward in 2019 after Epstein's arrest. President Trump has denied wrongdoing in connection with Jeffrey Epstein.
The files that reportedly document a Mar-a-Lago ban on Epstein that raises questions the administration has never answered. The files that investigative analysis found include dozens of withheld pages containing Trump assault allegations. All of that material is now fully accessible to federal prosecutors pursuing obstruction charges with no immunity shield standing in the way. That is what 9-0 means in practice. That is the legal landscape this administration woke up to, and the approval numbers tell you exactly how the public is processing this moment. 28%, not 29, 28, hitting a new floor with 45% of Republicans now saying they oppose his leadership. 45%. Nearly half of the Republican base is registering opposition to a Republican president in the middle of his second term. That number is the MAGA coalition collapsing in real time. And it is collapsing because of the Epstein cover-up more than any other single factor driving the polling right now. Here is the thing, the surface-level coverage is missing entirely. This 9-0 immunity rejection does not exist in isolation. It is arriving on top of a legal and political landscape already under historic pressure from every direction simultaneously. The tariff ruling struck down the administration's entire emergency economic authority. The ruling demolishing the New Jersey prosecutor scheme threw hundreds of criminal cases into constitutional chaos. The asset seizure authorization put multiple Trump properties directly in the crosshairs of court enforcement. The Epstein contempt orders against the Attorney General and FBI Director are still running with a jail or testify deadline coming up fast. And now, on top of every single one of those simultaneously active crises, a unanimous Supreme Court ruling has removed the last meaningful legal barrier standing between this administration and a full criminal obstruction prosecution. All of it at the same time, with gas prices hitting working families at every pump in the country. Legal analysts covering this story are now saying plainly that this ruling makes a criminal obstruction trial of a sitting president not a theoretical possibility, but an active and accelerating legal reality. The political implications of what 9-0 means for the midterms and for the Republican Party's ability to hold the House and for the 5-seat margin that stands between this president and impeachment are landing in ways that are producing the 28% approval number and the 45% Republican opposition figure simultaneously. Let me start with the immunity ruling itself, because the legal architecture of this decision is what makes it so devastating. The absolute immunity defense that Trump's legal team has been advancing throughout this Epstein obstruction case rests on a theory of presidential power that argues the president's official acts, including decisions about what documents the Justice Department shares with courts and with Congress, are shielded from criminal prosecution. It is a maximalist theory of executive authority that has been the foundation of multiple legal strategies across multiple proceedings throughout this administration, and it has produced victories at various stages that have allowed the administration to delay accountability and maintain the document suppression at the center of this entire crisis. The Supreme Court rejected that theory unanimously in the context of the Epstein probe, 9-0, no dissent, no partial concurrence, no qualification that leaves a door open for future immunity arguments in related proceedings. The ruling found directly that presidents enjoy no immunity from Epstein-related criminal probes and no immunity from congressional subpoenas seeking these documents. The court's message could not have been stated more clearly or more completely, and the unanimity of that message is what makes it irreversible as a legal matter in this case. The significance of that unanimous coalition cannot be overstated in the context of how this specific legal argument has been used throughout this administration's legal battles. The immunity theory only works as a delay mechanism as long as it retains enough judicial credibility to survive repeated legal challenges. A 9-0 rejection removes that credibility entirely and permanently. In this case, there is no remaining legal basis for claiming the documents are shielded from prosecution. There is no remaining legal basis for claiming the president's role in directing the Justice Department's obstruction pattern is protected from criminal accountability. The shield is gone. And what that shield was protecting is where this story becomes most significant and most politically explosive. The Epstein files that the Justice Department has been withholding from courts and from congressional investigators reportedly contain thousands of references to Trump. That number comes from analysis of what has been described in court proceedings and investigative reporting about the scope and content of the suppressed material. Thousands of references across documents that reportedly include call records spanning years, and records related to a documented Mar-a-Lago ban on Epstein that has never been fully explained by the administration. Investigative analysis of dozens of specifically withheld pages found that those pages contain Trump assault allegations. Pages withheld deliberately from federal courts, with a sitting president claiming immunity to justify keeping them suppressed. Now the immunity shield protecting that suppression is gone, 9-0, and what replaces it is an active federal investigation pursuing obstruction charges against an administration that spent months refusing to comply with court orders seeking these documents. Every deliberately withheld document is now potential evidence in that obstruction case. Every misleading statement made to prosecutors and courts during the suppression period is potentially relevant to the obstruction timeline. Every decision made at the Justice Department level about which documents to hand over and which ones to hold back is potentially part of the pattern that federal prosecutors are now free to investigate without immunity defense blocking their path. The contempt situation connects directly to this post-immunity legal landscape. The Attorney General faces a federal contempt order requiring sworn testimony by a deadline coming up fast. Jail is the explicitly stated consequence for non-compliance. The House Oversight Contempt citation with Republican crossovers adds congressional enforcement authority to the existing court-ordered compliance deadline. The FBI director faces his own separate contempt order with the same jail consequence for non-compliance. And both of them are now operating in a post-immunity legal environment where the documents they have been withholding are no longer shielded from federal prosecution. The choice facing both of them between now and that deadline is not a political choice. It is a legal choice with personal criminal consequences for non-compliance, and the 9-0 immunity ruling changes the legal calculus of that choice fundamentally. Complying with the contempt order means producing documents and testimony that the administration has been protecting through the immunity argument. Non-compliance means contempt of court charges and jail. Both paths lead to legal exposure of a kind that the immunity defense was specifically designed to prevent and can no longer provide. The statement from a Republican member of Congress that it is time for resignation or indictment is the clearest indicator of where at least a significant portion of the Congressional Republican caucus is landing in the aftermath of this ruling. That is not a fringe position anymore within the Republican Party. It is a position being stated on camera by a Republican member of Congress with significant standing within the constitutional conservative wing of the caucus. And it is being stated in the immediate wake of a 9-0 Supreme Court ruling that has removed the legal foundation of the administration's primary defense. When that member says resignation or indictment, he is accurately describing the two paths that this specific legal and political situation is now pointing toward. There is no longer a credible third option that involves the immunity defense continuing to protect the administration from accountability in the Epstein obstruction case. Now let me talk about the political fallout because the 28% approval and the 45% Republican opposition figure deserve a full and careful analysis of what they actually represent. 28% overall approval is not a polling rounding error or a temporary dip caused by a single bad news cycle. That is a sustained and deepening collapse in public confidence across every demographic category that this administration needs to maintain any functional governing capacity. And 45% of Republicans now opposing the president's leadership is a number that should be generating emergency-level concern in every Republican congressional office and every GOP campaign operation in the country right now. Because 45% of the Republican base opposing the president is not a protest number that bounces back when the news cycle shifts. That is a structural fracture that reflects real and deeply felt betrayal among voters who supported this administration on specific promises that are now being weighed against a reality that looks radically different from what they were promised. The Epstein cover-up is driving that fracture more than any other single issue because it cuts across the specific value proposition that this administration made to its base in ways no other issue does quite as directly. The promise was that this administration would expose the corrupt elite, would drain the swamp, would hold powerful people accountable for their crimes against ordinary Americans. And now the 9-0 Supreme Court ruling has confirmed that the administration's Justice Department has been deliberately withholding documents in a federal criminal case related to Jeffrey Epstein while claiming presidential immunity to justify that suppression. The base supporters who were promised accountability are watching their president claim immunity to avoid producing documents in an Epstein investigation. The cognitive dissonance of that gap is what is producing the 45% opposition number. And it is not going to close while the cover-up is the dominant political story. Gas prices running alongside every piece of this legal and political crisis every single day. Every working-class voter who fills up their tank right now is experiencing the economic reality of this administration directly in their wallet at the exact same moment they are processing the news of a 9-0 Supreme Court ruling, an Epstein file contempt orders, and Republican crossovers on a contempt vote against the Attorney General. These two realities are not separate news stories for the voters living through both of them simultaneously. They are the same story about an administration that promised to fight for them and is instead consumed by covering up its own connections to one of the most disturbing criminal cases in modern American history. The departure of key figures and the active campaign for resignation or indictment represent the two most visible public fractures in the MAGA coalition, but they are pointing at something much larger happening below the surface. When figures who are deeply embedded in the movement rather than critics from outside begin publicly using language like resignation or indictment, the signal that sends through the ecosystem is qualitatively different from what a Democratic attack ad or a mainstream media editorial can produce. It is a signal that the cover-up story has penetrated the coalition's own internal credibility structure in ways that are very difficult to contain or reverse. And the 9-0 ruling amplifies that signal enormously because it removes the legal argument that was the administration's most effective tool for telling his supporters that the Epstein obstruction was legitimate and lawful and protected. Let me give you 4 points that pull all of this together. First, a 9-0 Supreme Court ruling is the most complete form of judicial rejection the American legal system produces, and it permanently closes the immunity defense that has been the central legal strategy protecting this administration in the Epstein obstruction case. 6-3 rulings can be framed as divided partisan close calls that reasonable people can disagree about. 9-0 cannot. Not when the 3 justices Trump put on that court are among the 9 who rejected his immunity claim. Not when the ruling is unanimous across every ideological faction of the court simultaneously. The immunity argument is gone. Not weakened, not narrowed, gone. And what replaces it is a fully open legal pathway for federal prosecutors to pursue obstruction charges over the deliberate and documented withholding of Epstein documents. The legal shield protecting the administration from the most serious criminal accountability in this entire case has been unanimously removed by the highest court in the country. Everything that comes next happens in a post-immunity legal environment. Second, the content of the reportedly suppressed Epstein files is the core of why this administration has been willing to absorb so much legal and political damage to keep them buried. And the 9-0 ruling means those files are now fully accessible to federal investigators. Thousands of Trump references, call records spanning years, a Mar-a-Lago Epstein ban that has never been fully explained, dozens of withheld pages containing Trump assault allegations, all of it suppressed through a combination of Justice Department withholding and immunity claims that are now both legally defeated. The question the American public has been asking since this cover-up story first broke is the same question it is asking now with even greater urgency. What is in those files that is worth all of this? Worth Republican contempt crossovers, worth federal jail threats against the Attorney General and FBI Director, worth a 9-0 Supreme Court ruling on immunity, worth 28% approval and 45% Republican opposition. The answer to that question is what federal investigators are now in a position to find out without an immunity defense blocking their path. Third, the contempt deadline for the Attorney General and FBI Director is now the most consequential single date on the American political calendar, and the options available to both of them have narrowed dramatically in the post-immunity legal environment. Comply with the contempt order and produce testimony and documents that the immunity defense was specifically protecting. Face jail for non-compliance with the federal court contempt order. Those are the choices. In a pre-immunity world, there was a theoretical third path involving continued legal challenges to the contempt orders using the immunity argument as the basis for further delay. That path is gone. 9-0 closed it. And the people who have to navigate that reality by the deadline are the Attorney General and the FBI Director of the United States. The political and legal consequences of whatever they decide in the coming days are going to define the next chapter of this entire crisis. And every Republican member of Congress watching that deadline approach is doing their own calculation about what compliance or non-compliance means for the administration they have been shielding and for their own electoral situation heading into the midterms. Fourth, the convergence of a 9-0 immunity rejection with 28% approval and 45% Republican opposition and a fracturing coalition and a contempt deadline defines the most legally and politically exposed moment of this entire administration. 9-0 immunity rejection. Jail or testify contempt deadline. Republican contempt crossovers in the House. A Republican member publicly demanding resignation or indictment. 28% overall approval. 45% Republican opposition. The tariff ruling on the books. Asset seizure authorization against Trump's properties still active. Gas prices. The New Jersey ruling still creating constitutional chaos across hundreds of criminal cases. Key figures departed from the coalition. Legal analysts now describing an obstruction prosecution of a sitting president as an accelerating legal reality rather than a theoretical future possibility. All of it compounding. All of it simultaneously. All of it heading toward a midterm that requires holding a 5-seat House margin that Trump himself has identified as the only structural protection from impeachment. Here is exactly where we land. A unanimous 9-0 Supreme Court ruling rejecting absolute immunity in the Epstein obstruction case. Federal prosecutors now free to pursue obstruction charges with no immunity defense available. Thousands of reported Trump references in suppressed files now accessible to investigators. Dozens of withheld pages containing assault allegations per investigative analysis. A contempt deadline for the Attorney General and FBI Director with jail as the consequence. Republican contempt crossovers in the House. A Republican member demanding resignation or indictment on camera. 28% approval. 45% Republican opposition. Gas prices. Asset seizures pending. The MAGA coalition fracturing at the core. In a midterm environment that gets more dangerous for every Republican candidate with every passing day and every new ruling and every new headline. The question that has driven this entire story from the beginning still has not been answered. What is in those files? What required all of this? What required the immunity claims and the Justice Department withholding, and the misleading statements to prosecutors, and the contempt of court and the Republican crossover votes, and the riot threat posts, and the 9-0 Supreme Court ruling to try to keep buried? The answer to that question is now accessible to federal investigators in a way it has not been at any previous point in this case. And whatever that answer turns out to be is going to land in the middle of a political environment where 28% approval and 45% Republican opposition have already established that the American public has run out of patience.